What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Well, today we are going to be talking about a topic that means a whole lot to me since I have, in some senses of the word, semi-retired. And I don't even know what that means. That means that you're in the workforce to some extent when the opportunity presents itself, but you're generally out of it because you're not working full time. And there are so many people in so many different circumstances today. And when we hear the number of people out of the workforce, it does seem rather startling. 94 million or so. Yet when we break down that number, it includes those who are disabled, in college, care providers, and increasingly those who already worked for 40 or more years and have retired, or they're thinking of just playing around the edges of the workforce. And of course, that's a growing number in our society with so many folks born in the 50s and the 60s, the baby boomers. Social Security originally assumed that your demise would come right on the heels of you leaving the workforce. That's certainly not the case today. People are living longer, and they're looking at retirement as a whole new chapter of life. By 2020, the number of baby boomers will hit a staggering 71.3 million. Look out. This group could have a major impact for a quarter century or more. So how do you plan for it, and how do you make it fun and fulfilling? With us on America Trends is Bob Powell, who writes about retirement issues and produces the Retirement Weekly for MarketWatch. Hey, Bob, with all of your writing, you seem to be working awfully hard for a guy who's focused on retirement. Is that like being a diabetic working at a bakery?
Yeah, so I get this question all the time, Larry. People want to know, are you retired and you're just an expert in it? And I say, not really. I think it's more that I enjoy the subject. I want to help people retire. And all this writing and researching about the subject has given me, I think, a leg up on other people as well, that I should be able to enjoy a nice retirement when the time comes.
Oh, absolutely.
The time hasn't come yet because I really enjoy what I do.
Well, let me ask you, are most people ready to retire when they do? I've heard from some people that they were a bit lost at the outset, and I've got to say that I'm kind of in a semi-retirement phase where I'm transitioning to another aspect of life, and I did have a plan to do these podcasts, to get involved volunteering in broadcasting still, to get my band out more. I had a plan. How important is that?
Oh, it's really important, Larry, to have a plan because so many people, a lot of times what happens is there's been studies that looked at, like, why did you retire? And for many people, the answer was, well, I just got tired. I know, right? I got tired of my boss. I got tired of doing what I was doing. I got tired of my coworkers, and I just up and quit. And so those people are really behind the eight ball because they didn't retire for the right reasons. It may be the right reasons, but they did it without a plan in place. I mean, if you do hate your boss, you should at least think about what you would do when you go into the office and tell him to take this job and do with it what he must. So I think that for most people, I think, if you're thinking about it, if you're 60 years old and and even if you're 55, you're probably thinking about, okay, I'm in the home stretch here. What do I need to do? And so among the things that you need to do is to really do that plan and to talk about it with your spouse if you have one or a loved one, because you don't want to necessarily I just wrote a story about this topic, for instance. A lot of husbands and wives segregate what they're doing for retirement and never talk to each other about the most basic things like, how much are you saving in your 401k? And is that going to be enough for both of us? Or how much are you saving in your 401k? And is that going to be enough for both of us? So it's really important that you talk to someone, your spouse, about, your plans. And then the other thing is a lot of people do this without, I'll describe it as a role model. So I think what you want to do is interview a lot of people who have already retired and ask them how they approached it and what they did to get ready for it and how it turned out. And you'll find that I think a lot of people, not only did they not plan for it, but even if they did plan for it, the plan changed, right? So what's that famous saying? I forget, was it Eisenhower or someone, maybe Ulysses Grant, who said, you have a plan going into war, but it all changes the moment the bullets start flying.
Well, let's not make it analogous with war, but I was reading a great piece in the Wall Street Journal, like surprises, retirement, for better or for worse, will change your life more than you anticipate. And that's the consensus of those who should know best, retirees themselves. So what this article suggests is that when people do retire, there are lots of things that they're surprised about. Some are really positive things, that they really enjoy it, that they're in better shape than they've ever been in because they're exercising more, they're less stressed than they've ever been, and yet others who are a little bit discombobulated by the entire thing.
Yeah, and I think that, again, that speaks to this notion that what you really need to do is to be focused on what it is that would make you happy in retirement, and really, come up with a plan that says these are the things that I would like to do that I haven't done, or these are the things that I've always done that I'd like to do and would like to continue doing. And that could be, whatever it might be. It could be traveling, it could be fishing, it could be spending time with your grandkids. It could be going to watch, the Little League baseball games during the summer. It could be any of those things, but you really need to sort of say, well, what makes me happy? What, you don't, especially if you're retired and you have all that free time, there's really no sense unless you like doing it, spending your days, channel surfing.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good television on these days, I must say. Now, I know that your focus often is on accumulating enough financial resource to retire comfortably. Is that really, Bob, the key consideration, aside from health concerns, or that you hate your boss? I mean, because you can always get another boss, but you don't want to make yourself outside of the workforce, because that workforce is pretty unforgiving once you leave.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just wrote a story, Larry, that said, a lot of people like to keep working a little bit when they retire. They want to work part-time, 10, 20 hours a week. And I wrote a story for USA Today about how to stay in the workforce. And what was interesting to me about this was that there were 22,000 Facebook shares on this story. So there's a great interest in people retiring from their first career or from their 40-hour-a-week job, and then, but staying involved in the workforce for a paycheck either out of want or out of need. And, for those folks, those people obviously need to ask themselves, why do they want to work? Is it for the social reasons, or is it because they need the income, or is it for both those reasons? And then obviously, they need to figure out what it is that they want to do part-time. And for some of these folks, they need to understand what their skills and interests and values are, because you don't want to necessarily just take any old job, in the last, quarter of your life or last third of your life just because. And there's a lot of opportunities out there, and some of them may revolve around self-employment. A lot of older workers, there's actually been some studies done by the Small Business Association that say this is like the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs are people who are age 60 and older who have retired and are now launching businesses of one sort of another. So it's really kind of an exciting time for folks who want to retire but want to still stay engaged, and who may...
Well, what are they doing, Bob? Are they taking their hobbies or their avocations, their interests, and they're saying, now let me try to monetize this. I've become really good at woodworking or whatever it may be.
This is such an interesting question, Larry, because I asked one of the experts about whether you should turn your hobby into a career. And he said, yeah, you should try and monetize your hobby. But the key is... you want to test the concept with potential clients before you rely on this path as a source of income. You want to make sure that you can have real customers prepared to part with their hard-earned money for your product or service. Otherwise, it'll remain just a hobby. So the folks I talked to said, maybe it's less about your hobby and more about, taking the things that you're passionate about or applying your passion to your various skills, interests, and values, and seeing, if there's a job at the end of that, as opposed to trying to turn your hobby into a source of income.
And yet there are many people, perhaps, who really do have enough resource. They just want to feel that they're still in some way enveloped in the society. So there are all these volunteer opportunities, whether it's with the Senior Council of Retired Executives or some of these organizations where you can get on a regular schedule and you can put on that tie. There was a wonderful movie recently that Robert De Niro was in where he did that, and he just needed to feel there was some purpose, and he went back to work as an intern.
Yeah, there's a big part of, for men especially, where our jobs define who we are, that our sense of self-worth is tied up in our job. And so a lot of folks, want to keep, either that sense of purpose or they want to keep continuing to be a contributing member to society. I think those two organizations, you mentioned one, SCORE, Society of Retired Executives, and Service Corps, I forget the exact name, but it's an organization that helps for-profit groups where retirees go in and lend their expertise to whatever might be needed: marketing, operations, financial, et cetera, sales. And then there's one also called the Executive Service Corps, which is designed to help retirees who want to go in and help nonprofit businesses operate their businesses better. And those are great outlets for folks who want to keep contributing and don't need the income, because I think you get a stipend maybe, but not very much of one. And so those are great outlets if you have some skills. You've been a CFO, or you've been in sales and marketing, you've been in, running an assembly line, whatever it might be. There are companies out there that could benefit from your skills, knowledge, experience, and expertise. And it's a great way to stay involved, especially if you don't need money.
Oh, absolutely. The age-old question is, when do you know that you have achieved what is considered to be critical mass? When you can comfortably expect that you're going to be able to ride out what could be a long period of time based upon what you have accumulated. And I'm sure that's a question that you deal with all the time when you're writing for MarketWatch or USA Today. Tell us your thinking on this.
Yeah, I think so. The hard part is, there's this economic concept called consumption smoothing. And so one of the hardest parts about retirement planning is that you have to determine what your expenses will be in retirement, and that means you also have to figure out for how long those expenses will last. Two of the hardest things in the world, because we can't always predict how much we'll spend on travel or healthcare or housing as we age. You have to ballpark it so that you come up with some numbers to say, okay, this is what my expenses will be over X period of time, 20 years, 25 years. This is how much my expenses will be after I'm dead and my surviving spouse, lives on for another 5 or X years. And so you come up with a number that says, okay, I need 25 times my final salary or 10 times my final salary to have a shot at least at enjoying the same standard of living that I have today. And then, like I said, once you get into retirement, lots of things change. Typically, your expenses start to decline over time. That's partly because as you age, you start slowing down. You don't travel as much. You might downsize so your housing costs.
Yeah, but Bob,
down.
you have said to me, because we've had this conversation before, that at that early stage of retirement, it's the go-go stage.
Yep.
And oftentimes I'm finding that when you're not working every moment of every waking hour, the minute you go out the door, you're spending money.
Right. So in the go-go years, your spending doesn't decline necessarily. You're probably still in that 70 to 80% of pre-retirement income spending patterns. But as you move from go-go to slow-go to no-go, your spending patterns will change potentially dramatically, or the composition of those expenses will change. So healthcare, for instance, may only represent 5% of your expenditures in the go-go years because you're healthy. But once you get into your 80s, into the no-go years, maybe healthcare is now 15% of all your expenses, but travel and gifts and whatnot have dramatically declined. And again, these numbers change, but this is sort of looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey, which seems to suggest that as people age, their expenditures decline, right? But that's on average.
Yeah, well, how important is it to do that budgeting? Because my wife and I have been doing that, and we find lots of ways to spend money, even in this period, whether it's redoing your home or whether it's going on more trips at this stage. So we can find a whole lot of ways to really gobble up a lot of that accumulation.
Yeah, so here's an interesting thought that people have, right? So one of the things that they say is, okay, I've got these fixed sources of income that I'll use for my fixed or essential expenses, whatever those may be. And then I have this pile of money for my discretionary expenses. And I give myself permission to tap into that bucket for a nice around-the-world cruise or a nice trip to the Disney World with my grandkids or whatever it might be. But I'm not going to spend more than that, right? Because one of the things that we do know about sort of being in retirement is, especially when income is limited and resources may be limited, is that there are all these unexpected expenses that will hit you. So at some point you may need a new roof that you didn't think about. Or, you say, oh, I do want an addition because all my children moved back into my house with me, and they brought with them their kids because they fell on hard times or whatever it is, right? There's all these unexpected events that they're hard to plan for. But I think if what you do is you say, okay, I've got this bucket of money that I'm going to use for these one-time expenses, one-time and unexpected expenses, or one-time splurges, then I think you can do that. The one thing that people do have a problem with, Larry, and you may not have it yet because it doesn't sound like you do, but a lot of times people don't like to spend money now because they think that they might need it later for healthcare expenses or long-term care expenses or nursing homes. And so they don't give themselves permission to spend as much as they could early on in retirement because they fear they may need it later on.
Oh, absolutely. I could see that conservative approach really becoming the norm because you're wondering, well, how long do I need to make this last?
Yeah.
What are the types of hedges, Bob, that people need against the unexpected? You mentioned long-term care. There are those policies. They're getting more difficult to find. Liquid assets, wills, trusts, home equity lines of credit. What are the things people should be looking to?
Yeah, so like one of the things that people I think should look at, especially if they own their home and they're over age 62, is to look at taking out a reverse mortgage with a line of credit. And what this does is it's a way for you to tap into the equity in your home should you ever need it later on in life. So when I say a line of credit, I mean all you're doing is opening it up. You're not spending it, but what you may do is use it for those years in which you do need it, or you may use it. Some planners I've talked to have described using it in this fashion, which I think is kind of interesting. So you might have money in an IRA and it's in stocks and bonds. And typically people say, okay, you can withdraw 4% per year from that stock and bond
That's
portfolio.
Still the rule.
That's the rule of thumb. But what happens is if the market goes down, what you're doing is actually withdrawing 4% from a portfolio that's declining in value. So what they recommend is to say, instead of taking that 4% from the portfolio and then making it, when it's declining in value, and making it all the harder for you to take out more money over the next 20 years because you're taking out money from maybe a portfolio that's declining in value. Maybe you're in a bear market, right? You don't want to take money out from this thing, but you still need the money to live. That you take the money from your line of credit in your reverse mortgage, and you use that as a stopgap so that, when the market recovers, and assuming that the market goes up more than 4% or so per year, then you could return to taking the money from your portfolio and repay yourself as, over time in your line of credit. So it's a way to create a buffer. And why they say to do this instead of like using a home equity loan is that, at some point you may not qualify for a home equity loan because you don't have income, right? The bank will look at you and say, oh, you're retired, you have no income, you can't afford a home equity loan.
I know. People are in that weird space where they may have accumulated a good bit of money, but they don't have any ongoing income. And if they're not taking Social Security until a later point in time, then they say, I really don't have an income other than my own investments. And that's an interesting point about Social Security, which is that age-old question, Bob, when do you begin to take Social Security?
Yeah. So, 3 years ago, when before the BBA of 2015, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, there were all sorts of strategies that you could use to increase the overall value of your household Social Security benefit for both you and your spouse, file and suspend, and other things like that. That law removed those strategies, so you can't use them anymore. And so there are now two schools of thought. One is, wait to age 70 because that would give you the maximum Social Security benefit. And then the other school of thought is to take it pretty much at full retirement age. Because the difference, what's happened now is, it used to be that the full retirement age was age 65. It's going up to 66 now. And then by the time I retire, it'll be 67. And so now there's only a 3-year window in which you can create these delayed retirement credits. And people are saying, that 3 years doesn't really make that big of a difference, or the 4 years. So you might as well wait to full retirement age, because that at least gives you two things. One, it gives you 100% of what you're owed from Social Security. But it also, creates the survivor's benefit that would be much larger than had you taken Social Security, say, at 62, where it's greatly reduced and forever reduced because of that. So I'm becoming a fan of, if you have really long life expectancy, by all means wait to age 70. Your health is good. But for most average people, I think, you might be able to take it at full retirement age. Don't take it early. I mean, that means unless you're in poor health and you have a short life expectancy. But by and large, I think most people, should be okay at FRA.
We're talking to Bob Powell from MarketWatch. We're talking about new trends in retirement. And Bob, you were talking about 70. Let me bring you to 70 and a half. And that's the point where people have to take these mandatory distributions at that time. And they also have to account for taxes. So whatever they think their estate is there a certain number, such as 25%, that you deduct and discount because, in fact, that's going to the tax man?
Yeah, so it's a good point, Larry. I think so long before you get to age 70 and a half, one of the things that you might want to consider is meeting with a CPA or a tax professional to have them run some what-ifs. So one of the things that I recommend that people do is that they perhaps, if they have a really large IRA and that they know when they turn 70 and a half that they have to take out this money, these required minimum distributions, that oftentimes those distributions will bump you up into the next highest marginal tax bracket. And that's something that people might want to avoid. So one of the things that people could do, especially if they plan to delay taking Social Security but still need the income, is to start withdrawing from their IRAs when they're 66, 67 or so. And that does a couple things. One, it gives them the income that they needed to live on. It helps them build up delayed retirement credits with their Social Security. And then it reduces the amount that you would have to withdraw from your IRA come age 70 and a half, and maybe you could avoid being bumped up into the next highest tax bracket. So that's one strategy. The other is to, long before you retire too, is to make sure that you have a diversity of accounts. So maybe some folks before 70 and a half maybe want to start converting some of their traditional IRA into a Roth IRA. Mm-hmm. And that does a couple things. One is, yes, you'll have to pay the taxes at ordinary income tax rates, any amount that you take out of your traditional and convert into a Roth IRA. But it also gives you the opportunity, once you create this Roth IRA, to pull from whatever account makes the most tax-efficient sense when you get to be 70 and a half. You'll still have to take the RMD, but because you've converted some of your traditional to a Roth, that RMD will be much less. And also, if you do need money for living, you could take some from your Roth IRA, which is completely tax-free, and that gives you living expense money without pushing you into a higher tax bracket. So the point I think here is, you really, knowledge is, having this kind of knowledge far in advance of age 70 and a half gives you all these options. And, working with a tax professional or a financial professional who knows these strategies can really, be, the money's worth is probably, incredible if you can take advantage of some of these strategies.
Well, a lot of people say that we all need financial planners because there are so many variables that go into this mix as it relates to retirement. And yet you say that there's a trend in this area where we will be seeing an increasing use of software based on robo-advisors. So what does that really mean? I mean, should we be reliant upon the technology or somebody who's just got some really good advice gleaned over a long stretch of time? What's your...
Yeah, this is a really hard question. I'll be actually leading a panel discussion on this next month for MarketWatch in Boston. And so I look at robo-advisors as interesting in this respect. They have created what to me seems to be like low-cost money management. Mm-hmm. And I think they're perfectly fine for that. But what they've done now, I think, is to show the financial planning world that the value of a financial planner is less about their money management and more about these other things that we've just talked about. A robot can manage your money, right? I don't need a financial planner to do that. What I need a financial planner for is to tell me whether I should convert my traditional IRA into a Roth, how much and over how many years in order to create the tax, strategies that I need later in life. Or do I need a cash value life insurance policy because at some point when I have to start paying for Medicare Part B premiums, I might be able to, withdraw the cash value from my life insurance for living expense or borrow from the cash value in order to avoid having to pay a higher Medicare Part B premium. Right, and a robot's not going to tell you that.
No, I understand your point. There are a lot of qualitative things that only a human being can get inside your head and really figure out psychologically what it is you're comfortable with or not. And, we look at all of these things, and they can get overwhelming. And as you said earlier, the one variable that none of us can predict is what kind of life we're going to have and how long and in what level of good health is that going to be. How much does that block people from thinking that they've got to think about these issues whatsoever, that they just say, how do I know? And they throw up their hands.
Yeah. Look, it's a topic that most people don't want to deal with until they're faced with it. Not to name names, but I've come in, there's a personal situation not in our family where someone was just informed that they have prostate cancer and that they only have maybe 7 years to live. And, that changes everything. Once you know that there's an expiration date, you start thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that every day counts and that all my affairs are in order and whatever. And I think most people need to sort of approach their planning as if they know their expiration date. Right? It made me think, okay, I've got to go back and revisit. Is everything buttoned up and tied down and ready so that no one has to worry about a thing? Should I die tomorrow? Whether it might be that making sure your IRAs are all right, have the right beneficiary designations. Do you have the right amount of life insurance in place? Do
you have a will? Do you have a living trust?
Will? Yeah,
all of those things. Do you have a directive in terms of your health?
Right. And the same for your children too. I mean, one of the things, right? We always sort of maybe overlook this fact, but my children are now in their 20s, they're over 21, and so they all need advanced directives as well, right? They need to make sure that I can talk to their doctor because of HIPAA requirements. If there's no proxy in place, I'm not allowed to talk to their doctor because
well,
they're
even
over the age
things
of
like
majority.
your passwords on your various computer accounts. I mean, do we all have that in a safe place where somebody can find it if something happened because their digital life is so active these days?
Yeah, so that's another thing that people often overlook right now is digital estate planning. And there's a couple things that are interesting about that. There was a study done that looked at the value of people's digital assets. Mm-hmm. And it can be up in the tens of thousands of dollars in some cases.
What does that mean, for example? I mean, somebody's got a Facebook page with them, having beer pong events. What does that work? How do you monetize that?
Well, I think that one's hard to monetize. But there are things that you may own. Like I own several URLs. Now, no one's offered me $10,000 for the URLs, but they're part of what I own. And maybe my children, will inherit these URLs, and they could sell them, and maybe they'll be worth $5,000 or so.
Yeah, that's a great point, Bob. I'd never considered that. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that, and you may own music, you may own video. I mean, there's lots of things that you probably don't even think of as having. Most of the stuff you have is sentimental value, right? All my photos probably aren't worth anything to anyone but me. But maybe they're worth but they have sentimental value to my children. So. There's that, but one of the things that will happen is too, right? The way Google and Facebook and all these places are set up, your children don't necessarily have access. In fact, it would be illegal for them to use your email and password to access your accounts. Mm-hmm. So you need to put in place in your estate plan, your wills, the ability for them to access those accounts and get whatever it might be, bank information, brokerage information, your photos, all that stuff.
Yeah, these are all new considerations. That's why we're talking about trends in retirement. And one really disturbing trend that I've been reading about, Bob, is that there's an alarming amount of crushing debt that many are facing because of low savings and large loan obligations, or co-signing a loan and not thinking about it for your child. And what's happening in this regard?
It's really troubling, the percent of people who have not just mortgages or home equity lines of credit, but also Parent Plus loans and car loans and on and on and on, personal loans, oftentimes be for the benefit of their children. So, one of the things that I would recommend that people do is, okay, I understand if you have to do it, make sure you do it with at least someone looking over your shoulder and saying that's prudent or it's imprudent, and I've warned you. But I think the other thing is, given the amount of money that's out there, having a life insurance policy in place that would cover those various debts would be highly critical. That at least means that you'll be able to have those debts discharged and someone's not burdened with having to pay them off later.
So you're not leaving it for your spouse. So there's $200,000, $300,000 that may be sitting there, and you die, and they need to be able to wipe those off the books.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting. This is Bob Powell, of course. He writes about retirement. He thinks about it all the time, though he hasn't done it himself. So he's still working very, very hard on our behalf, and we're so glad that he's on with us today on America Trends. How important is it to get away from some of the numbers and the quantitative element to this? How important is it that your friends or colleagues are starting to retire or transition to a more flexible work relationship for us to feel that we have permission to do it?
So, this is a big problem, right? Much of what we do in our life is one degree of separation. We look at what our neighbors are doing, where they're traveling, what the quality of their life is, and you think, well, I could do that, but I can't because I don't think I'm ready yet, or I could do that, and I just haven't given myself permission to do that. And I think, you don't want to necessarily use your neighbors or your friends or your old college roommates as your benchmark, right? Everyone's had a different life and different fortunes and different luck and whatever it might be. But I think, that it probably does serve as a way for you to refocus on yourself and to say, well, how close am I, or how far away am I from being able to do what they're doing? And so I think you should use it as that kind of opportunity, as a check-in, as opposed to keep up with the Joneses kind of thing.
Yeah, and you said earlier it's good really to consult with others who have made the plunge and gone into this transition. I'm just wondering about this transition, and we're talking about new things that are happening in retirement, and a lot of folks want to stay, as you say, in the workplace to some degree. Tangentially, they still want to have a role or maybe be a consultant or maybe go down to part-time. How easily can they find these situations available to them in the workplace of the 2020s going forward? Is this something that workplaces are now saying, we've got to figure out what to do? There is so much talent in this group of baby boomers. We don't want it all to just go away.
Yeah, so I would say that, there are some companies, usually the larger ones, have figured out ways to keep their older workforce, in place through contract work or part-time work or phased retirement of one sort or another. And if you want, AARP does a really good job of identifying the 50 or so companies out there that are doing the best job of retaining older workers and attracting older workers. A lot of them are in the healthcare field, some in the technology world, defense industry. There's some companies, and so I would recommend that there's a website called Life Reimagined, run by AARP, and it's a really good resource for people who are looking for paid or not for pay work, but also looking to figure out how they would structure their life in retirement. And I think that's a good resource, not just for the money part, but for the emotional side of retirement. The other thing is, if you can't find a big company to sort of to help you with this regard, I think, a lot of people just set up a consultancy and work in their field, but don't necessarily have to work for someone. There's a story. I know someone who had worked for the Food and Drug Administration for many years, closing down, inspecting, and in some cases closing down pharmaceutical companies, and then when he retired, he became a consultant to those very same pharmaceutical companies that he'd closed down to help them get back in business.
Well, there's a revolving door for us.
He's got them
Bob,
coming
I've got to
going.
ask you,
I'm
some of
so
the qualitative...
jealous.
On the qualitative side of the ledger, we're reading all the time these articles about where to retire. And we read these stories about the best places to retire. And sometimes they're in the north, oftentimes in the south. What are the considerations?
Yeah, so it hasn't been published yet, but I just wrote a story. It's based on some data that came out of CCH that looked at the most tax-friendly states. Mm-hmm. And so the very first sentence, second sentence in the story is, don't let the tax tail wag the retirement dog. But let me at least wag it for a little bit, which is a lot of times people say, oh, I'm going to go move to the most tax-friendly state. And what they do is they forget to consider what their sources of income might be and how that state taxes that particular type of income. So if, for instance, you plan on working in retirement, well, you probably want to go to a state that doesn't necessarily tax personal income. But on the other hand, if the bulk of your income will be coming from Social Security, you probably want to move to a state that doesn't tax Social Security. So that what's the most tax-friendly state for you will depend on what your sources of income are. And I would tell people that they need to, and when they read my column when it gets published, they could look at, well, these are the states that are most beneficial given the types of income I might have. The caveat here, though, is a lot of times people say, oh, I'm going to move to a state that has no personal income taxes. And they forget that, those states have to, have to get tax revenue somehow. And so they may have really high property tax rates, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they have to sort of make sure that they're not necessarily moving somewhere and not look, but they have to look at their overall tax burden. And let's say that, they move to a state that has no personal income tax, they have a high property tax rate, and these are people who don't get to take advantage of itemized deductions on their tax return. Well, so all that property tax goes to waste in a way, right? So you may want to find out, exactly, work with a CPA or a tax professional and have them do some what ifs that say, if I move to Florida, Nevada, Georgia, whatever it might be, North Carolina, how will it look in reality in terms of my total after-tax return when I consider not only my income, but my expenses, right? So, not only my real estate taxes, but my sales tax, if I'm a big consumer, if I plan to buy a house or a big boat or whatever it might be, you're going to face taxes both on the income and the expense side.
That's a good point. Look for luxury taxes. And speaking of the impact on the economy of this glut of baby boomers, what is it going to be? When you look at it, this is about 28% of the population. And I read where we are now controlling 70% of the net worth of all households. And if you ever go out during the week, and you see who's out shopping at places like Costco or Walmart, there are so many older folks. I mean, there's incredible buying power. Is that something that older folks can leverage in some way?
Well, I think it is, and I don't have necessarily good advice on how they could do that, except that this is a world that now caters to them. And so if they're smart about how they shop and where they shop, they should be able to at least get the best bang for their buck. I have not yet written about this notion of how to do that. Mm-hmm. So thanks for the story idea.
Anytime. No, it is a fascinating thing because we really do control so much. Are you surprised that advertisers and marketers haven't really awoken to this, other than those who work for the pharmaceutical companies, that we really do have? Now, they think that all of our brand buying and all of our big purchases are done, but I can tell you, as someone who's buying a lot of things now, because washing machines do break no matter what age you are or whatever it may be, I think they've underestimated the impact of this group.
Well, I think they have, and I think they've done it. I could be. This is a speculation on my part, Larry. Is that they think that the buying habits or the brand affiliation is set among older buyers, right? What's the best example I could give? My father bought Craftsman tools, and his father bought Craftsman tools, and that's why I buy Craftsman tools. And why would I ever change at this point? I don't know. It's just a guess, but it's possible that we're set in our ways.
I think though they misread us, because I think if you read Consumer Reports, you read columns like yours, people do change and they evolve and they get different impressions about products and services over time. With that said, Bob, in closing, because this has been great to have you on with us talking about trends in retirement, what perhaps do you think is the most surprising trend that you're now seeing in the way that retirees are living in these times?
Well, I think so. There's two trends. There's the folks who have it's the ant and the grasshopper story. I think, right? That the folks who have done what they needed to do to enjoy the retirement are living that dream, right? And I think for a lot of people, that's probably not a surprise to anyone who knows those folks. And then I think there are folks who did not do all that they could to plan for the retirement that they desired. And you see them, I think, struggling. And this is perhaps, to me, the saddest part about retirement is you have worked so hard to get to this point where you wanted to enjoy your leisure time, and yet you didn't do what it was necessary to enjoy it. And so now you've had to trim back on your standard of living. You've had to accept things, right? Your friends go on a vacation and you can't join them. Your friends go out to dinner and you can't join them, right? Your friends are going out to a movie and you can't join them. And so that, to me, that's perhaps the saddest part about retirement is that, and you don't get those years back to make up for it, right? This is pretty much the end of the line. So to me, that trend of either living the life that you desired is there for those who planned ahead, and living the life that you didn't desire is there for those who didn't plan ahead. Those are the two big trends I see.
All right. Bob Powell, I want to thank you for joining us today on America Trends, and we'll have you back again to talk about new trends as they continue to evolve as it relates to retirement. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Larry, for having me on the show.